I'm Victor, and I will be talking about our practical approach for taking down Avalanche botnets under real-world constraints. And I'll structure my presentation around the three main parts of the title, and I'll start off by explaining what this Avalanche thing is that I'll be talking about. And no, I haven't come to sunny San Diego to talk to you about snow. Instead, Avalanche was the world's largest and most sophisticated cybercriminal syndicate law enforcement had ever encountered. And what they did was operate an advanced infrastructure consisting of a network of proxy servers that supported the command and control communication for over 20 malware families. Avalanche was first seen in 2008, and by the next year, they were already responsible for 2/3 of all phishing attacks in the world. And throughout the next 8 years, they did a lot of damage. They infected over 2 million clients. So in 2012, German law enforcement started an investigation into this botnet. And together with other organizations such as the FBI and Europol, on the 30th of November 2016, they succeeded in taking down the botnet. And in the subsequent years, they did yearly cleanup actions, and we were involved in the 2019 action and actually contributed with our research to this effort. So a major part of this takedown, and the reason why it's so large, is that law enforcement tried to take down the domains that were being used for this communication between client and server. And this communication is supported by something called a domain generation algorithm, or DGA. And in a nutshell, these are algorithms that run both on the client and on the server. And these tend to output tens, hundreds, sometimes even thousands of domains, usually every day. And on the server side, the botnet owner only needs to have one of these domains active, because the client will try all of these domains at the same time, and once it reaches a valid domain, it will then receive its command. Now, previous research focused on trying to discern or detect the random patterns in these domains. But we saw that in the DGAs of Avalanche, there are certain malware families who tend to output more human-looking domains. And not only does it make it more difficult to detect whether a domain is generated by a DGA, it also runs the risk of domain collisions, because sometimes you will have benign domains registered by legitimate users or organizations who happen to be on a domain that is also output by these DGAs. And that's a challenge that law enforcement had to face. So what they did is look ahead in the takedown. They were able to reverse engineer these DGAs and extract the domains that the malware would be using in the following year. And for the 2017 and 2018 iterations, this amounted to millions of domains. Now, the vast majority of these, as you can see on the top, was unregistered. So there, law enforcement could just go to the registry and say these domains should be blocked from future registration. However, a small part was already registered at the time, even though those domains would only become active far into the future. And those are also the domains that we focused on in our research. So you have the benign domains, which are these accidental collisions, and there law enforcement takes no action. And you have the malicious domains, which are seized through a court order and then sinkholed to law enforcement infrastructure. So in our study on this real-world takedown, we sought to design a more automated approach to this classification, because previously, law enforcement had to go and manually classify all of these domains, which is an extensive effort. Of course, this kind of setting also imposes very strict requirements on the accuracy, because if you take down a benign domain, the service of that domain is interrupted. And if you don't take down a malicious domain, the botnet could respawn, because the attacker will register that domain and then get back into contact with the clients. So accuracy is very important. Through our collaboration with law enforcement, we had the opportunity to work with real-world ground truth. So not artificial or synthetic data sets, of which previous research has shown that they may not be that representative or reliable. However, on the flip side, this ground truth is quite limited. We are only talking about a few thousand domains, which are not even evenly distributed. So we have to take these biases into account when we're developing our approach. So, of course, we then went to the state of the art. We looked at what's already existing in the space of classifying benign and malicious domains. However, we found that there are a number of constraints that are imposed by the real-world setting, which means that we cannot readily apply the state of the art. And we identified three major constraints. The first one is that the patterns in registration and configuration of these domains tend to be more individual. And I have two examples. The first one is that the registration of these domains does not occur in bulk, as was detected in spammer domains, for example. Instead, because the attacker only needs one domain active at a given point in time, they don't have this need to register a lot of domains with the same registrant details at the same registrar within a short time span. On the other hand, the research that focuses on the lexical pattern, so detecting how random these domains look, all assume that the domain generated by a DGA is malicious, but of course we know that all of our domains are generated by a DGA, but are not necessarily malicious. The second constraint is that our analysis occurs proactively, so we can't rely on detecting any ongoing malicious activity. Instead, we have to work with detecting malicious intent in the registration. And finally, we don't want to make any active connection to these domains. And that's because we want this operation to occur stealthily, as it's a law enforcement investigation. This means that we can't, for example, actively collect web content, and the operation has to occur stealthily because an advanced attacker might detect this incoming traffic, which occurs way before the domain would become active, and on protocols, for example, that are not expected, and therefore shift their strategies. So given these constraints, we set out to develop our practical approach. And our protocol started off with enriching our domain sets with comprehensive feature sets. So we did an analysis of the full life cycle of a domain, and we picked the data sets that represent each step in this life cycle, of course, within the constraints. So again, we can't, for example, use web content. So in the paper, we have a full list of the features. We also discuss which features we didn't include because of these constraints. And we also discuss whether it's possible to evade these features. We also collected historical data, so data accurate as of the takedown, because otherwise we would see the law enforcement sinkholing infrastructure. But again, we could only do this if it's possible. You can't go back and retrieve historical search engines results, for example. Another problem we faced is that for some domains, we don't have certain data sets, and this can go up to 20% in some cases. However, we still have to classify all domains because that's what law enforcement would have to do. So we developed an ensemble model where we have different submodels for the different combinations of available and unavailable data sets. And then when we have to classify a domain, we pick the model that is most fitting and take its output as our final classification. So now onto our results. And we developed our approach iteratively. We started off with a base model, so training on one iteration, testing on the other. But we saw that our performance numbers were not really sufficient for this kind of operation. Moreover, we found concept drift. So performance within 1 year is much better than across years. And therefore, we extended our approach with a priori classifications. This means that upfront, a small part of the domains of the target takedown are already manually classified. And this is to capture some of the novel patterns that we expect in the new takedown. However, even there, although we see some improvement, it's not really up to the level that we desire. So there, we started developing a more hybrid model where we have some sort of human oracle. So somebody who we assume to make perfect decisions, for example, using other data sets, more data sets, some of those historical data sets that we didn't have access to. And this synergy of human and model does yield significantly better performance. And the way this occurs is that a posteriori, so after the fact, the human analyst is employed to make manual classifications. So the model outputs those domains of which of which it is least certain in its classification, and those are passed on to the oracle. Now, I want to highlight that for the 2019 iteration, where we contributed, we don't do this performance evaluation because it would be unfair to evaluate on ground truth to which we contributed, but we do see a similar reduction in the manual effort that has to be put in. What we can also extract from the model is those features that have the highest influence on the model. And I've highlighted, in this case, the time-based features, which are very important to the model and which are also quite hard to evade. You can't go back in time and register an old domain. So this means that our model is somewhat robust to evasion. What you also can extract is those data sets that are most important. And here, of course, it becomes important to think about the availability of the data. So if you don't have whois data, for example, you do expect some impact on the performance of the model. However, what we also see is that those time-based features are also captured by other data sets. So there is some redundancy. So even if you can't acquire a certain data set for a certain domain, the model is still able to extract this kind of information from other data sets and yield an accurate classification. So with this, I've covered all the parts of the title, and I can recap what we've learned in our study. So we wanted to automate the classification of registered DGA domains for the real-world use case of the Avalanche takedown. And this real-world setting yielded a unique opportunity. We could work on a real case with real ground truth that accurately represents what law enforcement is seeing in the wild. And we could have a real-world impact with our contribution to the 2019 iteration. However, there are also certain constraints that are imposed by this real-world setting. So we have missing data. We can't use certain data sets that would be very interesting to our model. And we have those strict performance requirements brought about by the severity of an error. And therefore, we developed a hybrid model. So we take this synergy between the model and the analyst. And this model also provides us with useful insights into how attackers operate. And these kinds of insights are paramount to increase the effectiveness of takedowns in the future, and therefore ensure that we stay one step ahead of the attackers. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions. Please use the microphone, I think.
So I'll ask a question while he walks through the microphone. How does this generalize beyond Avalanche? I mean, have you tested like your classifier or any other data set or on domains that are actually not Avalanche?
Yeah, we haven't because we didn't have access to this kind of real ground truth for the other botnets. But we think that the insights that are provided by our model, so in terms of the features that are important, can translate to other takedowns. But it would be interesting to be able to have access to this kind of data set and replicate the experiment.
But you could, for example, run it on without the ground truth to at least evaluate false positives, no? With the same classifier that you actually have.
Without the ground truth, you say?
Well, without retraining, basically. It's like, does your classifier actually is really only capturing features of how Avalanche, right, was registering the domains, or is your classifier actually like capturing something more general? I guess that would be my question.
Yeah, we think something more general because we explicitly avoided any features that are specific to Avalanche. So for example, the malware family is a data point that we have, but we don't include it in the classifier because we would expect that our classifier would be more biased towards the botnets that exist in Avalanche specifically. So the feature set is agnostic of the fact that it's the Avalanche botnet, but it's just that we have this ground truth that we have access to.
All right, Saurabh Bagchi from Purdue. So you showed that the pattern of domain registration is not a bulk pattern, but more individual pattern.
Yeah.
Can you give us the insight behind that? And secondly, for an adaptive adversary, if they know that that's what you're looking for in the patterns, how easy or difficult would it be to reverse engineer this?
Yeah. So I have normally a backup slide. Oh, I don't. Sorry. We did the analysis on the domains that we see in our dataset versus the domains that were used in Predator. The study that we are basing our finding on that in the spammer case, you see bulk registration, while in our case we saw that basically there are very few domains that exhibit this bulk registration pattern in terms of that within one day you will only see a handful of domains registered at the same registrar within that 1 day time span. As opposed to, in the case of Predator, they had within 5 minutes, sometimes 50 domains being registered with the same details, with the same patterns. If you could remind me of your second question, please.
Yeah, the evasion or an adaptive adversary attack.
Yeah. So again, we see that the time-based features are most important, and it's difficult for DGAs to automatically adapt to basically picking all the domains, for example. There's also an increasing cost in terms of evasion, and we could include additional features into our model even, if necessary. Also, in terms of the analysis that we did this historical analysis, so we indicate that there are certain data sets that are missing. So if we would deploy this more in a real-world setting, in a more real-time setting, we still have other data sets that we could use and that are probably also much more difficult to deviate.
Okay, so with the results, it showed that the if the classifier had some data within the same year, it somehow performs better for that particular year. And what's the insight for that?
So it's this concept of concept drift. So when you train and test on the same kind of data set, you assume that within this data set you have very similar patterns, and the model picks up on those patterns. While if you split across multiple years, then we see that in the second year, there are other patterns that the model does not pick up, and that therefore mean that the model is not able to correctly detect these kinds of patterns in the data.
Right, so why do we observe this? Does the adversary change the, how they generate the pattern across years, or?
Yeah, we don't have ground truth on this, but we assume that other people are trying to take over the Avalanche botnet because police also arrested some of the perpetrators of the botnet, and this leaves an opportunity for attackers for other attackers, other groups, to also run this DGA, get the domains, and try to take over the botnet. So you might have multiple groups kind of competing for these domains, and therefore exhibiting slightly different patterns that are adaptive over time.
I see. So over the period of a year, then this pattern slowly changes over time, is what you're saying?
That could be the case, yes.
Okay.
But it's the law enforcement repeats this operation every year. So that's the scope of the data set.
I see. Right.
So my question about the availability of the data, such as, for example, who is data, which may be protected by the GDPR or other things. I mean, even if when you go to the passive DNS, maybe the time fields that you're looking for, they are not there. They have aggregated times like first seen and last seen, but the other detailed times, they may not exist there. So how do you deal with that?
For example, for whois data, you mentioned GDPR, but we assume to some extent, or we know that ICANN is proposing that law enforcement can get some sort of privileged access to this kind of more detailed registrant data. So in collaboration with registrars, with registries, law enforcement could be able to get more detailed data and more accurate data than would be available to us as researchers. And the same could be the case, for example, for passive DNS data.